So today I'm going to talk about a topic that I've been working on with many people around this room on for quite some time. Phil, could you go to the next slide, please?
They get in the mood.
And it's, you know, I think one of the recent kind of waves in psychology is this idea that prosocial is the winning move. Being kind, considerate, supportive, caring, helpful is the winning move. You've seen a number of bestsellers on this topic, like Give and Take, and some work I do with Paul Atkins on prosocial principles, like trying to deliberately create communities that cooperate and work well together. And one of the questions that this paper asks is, well, what is the key to building friendship? Is it being prosocial? And we've certainly seen a lot of these kinds of arguments in the past literatures. So Belginder, myself and Phil and others published a paper on empathy and showed that that was quite central to building of friendships. And Wilson, Hayes, Bigland, and Embry have argued in their books on prosocial that cooperation was essential in our evolutionary path to our survival, that humans that work together are much more likely to survive. So we've developed a genetic predisposition to work together, to be together, to connect, and we're much stronger together than we are separate. And Grant's best-selling book, Give and Take, argues exactly this, that people who are givers have an advantage in organizations over people who are exchangers. They give and take, they kind of like do something if you do something for them, and over takers. So it seems like the picture that's being painted is one where good people win. And you certainly see this, well, you don't have to name this one because it's in the title. But this is not just a theme in the scientific community, which, by the way, is a theme I want to believe, but also is a dominant theme in modern media. So the typical story goes something like this. There are some mean girls and there's a nice girl. And in this particular movie, well, usually the mean girls lose in the end and the nice girl wins. In this particular movie, my daughter explained it to me because that's what I did. She becomes mean. She realizes being mean is not good, and they all become nice, I think.
Oh, one gets hit by a bus, so she pays the price.
That's good to have an expert. All right, next one. And of course, one of the other themes is... What's it called? Nice. Is that you have the bad boy or the bad girl, and they secretly have a heart of gold, and this is what this is about. This guy seems like he's a real bastard at first, but he turns out to be one of the nicest guys you could ever meet. And so that's right. So the badness is really just hiding a good heart. Next slide. And of course, the Karate Kid, where you see this skinny kid kind of defeating this very large man, because this guy's the bully and his sensei is quite a bully, and so good triumphs over evil. Being good triumphs over evil. So this is what drew me to the subject. I'm making it quite broad. I'm going to kind of focus it really right into adolescence in a second. But next slide, please. There are some things that have been happening that have caused me to question this, because I'm one of those people who believes that, and I still believe it, but I'm just going to, I have to say a few things have shaken me. Donald Trump, if you're watching this. And next slide. And Harvey Weinstein. I think what's striking about this is not just that antisocial people seem to make it to the top, right? But how long they do so. Like 30 years and 80 women, and this guy's not like doing something off on some small island where nobody's seeing him. He's a very public figure. It strikes me that there's something about the context that supports antisocial behavior, aggression, nastiness, that reinforces it. And so this is kind of what I'm trying to take a piece of this question, what is it that reinforces it, and focus it into adolescence.
You didn't have any female examples, though.
Yeah, I did.
Trump.
Oh, no, the mean girls.
That's fictional.
We'll talk about that.
Your picture's coming us too.
That would have been good.
On the way to the top.
That's awesome.
So there is data in the literature suggesting that sometimes aggression and hostility are beneficial. Successful leaders are moderately hostile. Antisocial youths are often viewed as fun, charming, prestigious, and popular. And the kids with a bit of aggression seem to have the highest social competence. Next. And so...
That's disturbing.
It is. That's a disturbing image, isn't it? The reason I wanted this, I feel like I'm one of those cooperative people who believes doing good is the best way, and I still believe that. But I'm beginning to wonder if there is some group of people who don't, even though this is the common myth and theme in our society, who don't believe this and who are able to kind of go around the well-meaning sheep and be a wolf. Next slide. And kind of bypass a lot of the rules and kind of get to the top and get control of resources and power in a way that prosocial people don't notice it's happening, because we keep assuming that what drives everything is goodness. So my kids' teachers say that you can't exclude somebody from a group even if they're bullying you, just as an example. So now bringing it into, one more please. The adolescent context. So begin to kind of touch on this question of what are the upsides of aggression and antisocial behavior. Can we see this in adolescent friendships and well-being? So we're going to ask in this, what are the social benefits and costs of being prosocial and antisocial? And next slide. One more, please. And we're going to say that there's going to be several factors that determine costs and benefits. So the core idea is that for antisocial behavior to thrive, for coercion, dishonesty, all that to thrive, you need a context to support it. If there's a niche where it's reinforced, it will happen. And so we're going to talk about several different contexts where I think it happens. We're going to talk about configurations of antisocial and prosocial behavior, type of friend, whether it's opposite sex or same sex, and the developmental stage, whether it's early adolescence, grade 8 to 10, or late adolescence, grade 11 to 12. Next slide. And I'm going to set this in terms of Patricia Hawley's resource control theory. And the idea is that if you look at the literature on aggression, there's like a big chunk of it in youth research which characterizes it as a kind of disorder, as an indication of some sort of trauma that's happened early in life, or some sort of ill mental health, a problem. What the evolutionary types tend to do is think of it as something that is an actual adaptation and a strategy in a particular environmental niche. Aggression is a way of gaining control of resources, for example. And within this kind of evolutionary framework, cooperation is also a strategy for gaining resources. So there's no ethical superior kind of strategy in evolutionary terms. They're both being used to control resources. So you can kind of start to apply this idea to youth. So aggression has a function. This is why it's so hard to eradicate bullies, because bullying allows you to be socially dominant and potentially attractive and popular. We're going to talk more about that. But so does cooperation. Cooperation has benefits.
Breakfast Club.
Thank you. Did everybody recognize this movie? Good. Thank you. Cooperation allows you to be part of a clique, to be kind of build strong social connection, but aggression allows you to go against the group or against somebody if they're opposing your interests. Next slide. So in this idea of resource control types, there's a typology which is based on whether you're high or low in prosociality or antisociality. So people who are prosocial control type, they tend to be very high in prosocial, pretty high, and low in antisocial behavior. So these are the ones who cooperate and get along well with others, the ones that the teachers love. Next. Then you have the antisocial group. This profile is high in antisocial and low in prosocial behavior. Non-strategic. These are kids that are low in both. So I don't know exactly what they look like, but I think of them as video gamers or something like that. And then the bi-strategic. So this, in Pat's kind of framework, is the winning quadrant. which, and she and I, in writing this paper, had quite a bit of tension around this one because I don't like them, but I guess that's not science. But for her, this is the best quadrant because it allows the person to flexibly use cooperation or aggression to get their needs met. So they can both kind of go with the group and bring the group kind of to work with them, or they can oppose the group if that's what's needed. So a big part of this kind of profile approach is that this combination is the winning combination. So this would be somebody who's, for example, aggressive and empathetic. And so you could imagine somebody who has empathy, ability to take perspective, and can be aggressive, could be quite effective with that aggression, right? They might be able to use it in a way that they know they're not pushing the person too far. So they might be able to use it strategically. They might be able to mend bridges after using it and getting their way. So this combination is meant to be the best in resource control theory. Okay? So one of the big things that we're going to look at is gender in this, because these resource control types are quite different for males and females in opposite sex relationships. So if you look at adolescent development, it starts off like my son is in third grade, and he really isn't attracted to girls at all and only wants to play with boys. And every girl that's interested in him, because girls seem to be interested in boys earlier than boys are interested in girls, he accuses them of picking their nose and eating the boogers. So I haven't made any headway in convincing me that girls are okay, but I think it'll just happen. By early adolescence, it starts to flip, and kids start to spend more and more time with the opposite sex. And these are not the same as romantic relationships. I remember when me, Belginder, and Phil kind of published this paper on empathy, one of the things was that empathic boys were very popular with girls, but empathic girls were boys seemed to be disinterested or something like that. But the way they interpret, this sounds like an argument for boys to be empathic, right? But the way that the press reacted, and a lot of people who, you know how it got published on websites and people responded, a lot of the way people responded was like, this is proof that empathy is bad because those are the kids that aren't in the romantic relationship, they're just in the friend zone. So those empathic boys who had all these girls saying, yeah, this is my close friend, this was seen as a negative thing because it was like the friend zone. And there's not going to be any romance. So that it's interesting that even culturally we kind of sense that empathy may not be a good thing. I think it is a good thing, but people believe that it could set you up for failure in some way. And 8th grade, by the time you hit 8th grade, which is the beginning of our sample, boys and girls like to hang out with the opposite sex. They enjoy that. So, one of the questions we have in this study is, who gets nominated as a close friend? Which type of person gets nominated as a close friend? So, in this study, resource control can be thought of as the number of close friends that nominate you. So, I don't know if you guys remember high school, but it was a terrifying, stressful occurrence where you basically fighting for friends, fighting to be in the group, fighting not to get bullied. Sitting alone is absolute death. And so you can think of the resource control battle as happening as an attempt to kind of control friends, in a sense. I'm speaking in terms of resource control theory. So the question is, so these are resource control strategies. You could have potential prosocial strategies such as taking perspective, antisocial strategies such as aggression and dominance. And the question is more better? So the kind of unique prediction of resource control would be that the bi-strategics should get the most friends. Which, for me, Pat had literally to force me to say this because I could not bring myself to say it. Because I said, I assumed the prosocials would have it, but that's not what the theory says. It says that because you can use both strategies, it makes you more likely to be able to win friends. And we made a gender prediction in this one in particular. And that is that the use of social dominant strategies like aggression and rule breaking is likely to have a different effect in terms of signaling on males and females. same sex and opposite sex. So that being dominant and aggressive is not likely to be as well received amongst the same sex, where you're actually in the same dominance hierarchy. Does that make sense? So being the dominant male is not as pleasing to other males. So there's a couple pieces of data that suggest this. So we found clear evidence that people like opposite sex extroverts, but not same sex extroverts. And there's a more direct study showing that the aggressive kids tend to be rejected more by same sex than opposite sex peers. So this is starting to suggest that somebody with a resource control strategy that uses coercion, which is bi-strategic and antisocial, may not have as much of an advantage in same-sex friendships. But they could have an advantage in opposite-sex friends, and this is why. Basically, can you go back a slide, Phil? The core idea is that same-sex friendships have lots of ways of kind of forming. You hang out together, you do things together, there's lots of activities. You don't need to have all these kind of incredible social skills to be able to hang out with your mates. I mean, I had mates in high school and we didn't have any social skills, we all hung out together. But to reach across the great divide, which is the opposite sex, something I never succeeded at, by the way. So I think I was in the non-strategic category. You need to be able to signal. You need to be noticed. So if you don't use, because you don't have the normal ways of kind of just hanging together, that just comes with experience. So the research does show that more experience suggests that people get to, they're more affected by your traits, but with opposite sex, they don't hang out as much together. And so the use of kind of strategies like aggression, which establish your status and hierarchy, and empathy would be social, like skills that would make it more likely for you to attract the opposite sex. And would be more useful for attracting the opposite sex than the same sex. I'll put it the opposite way. Non-strategic kids, boys and girls, should be virtually invisible to the opposite sex. But they're not going to be invisible to the same sex because we're all hanging out playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? So like, yeah, they can see me, but the girls aren't going to notice me. Next. Let's just go down. Can you go to one more slide? Let me just see where. Okay, up. Yeah. So let me just make some concrete predictions based on this. How's the time going? Oh, good. I'm fine. Okay, so does that make sense so far? So things like coercive strategies are less useful in same-sex relationships where you're actually, we're in the same hierarchy fighting for the same status. But so there's a downside to being coercive within same-sex, but not necessarily opposite sex. And using social strategies is more important in getting noticed by the opposite sex than the same sex. Those are the kind of two big premises of the paper. Does that make sense? Yeah? Everybody understands? I can explain it. All right, cool. So this whole literature is based on pre-existing cut points to establish if you are bi-strategic or whatever. So it's usually a bi-strategic person is classified as +1 standard deviation in aggression, +1 standard deviation in, say, prosociality, like an empathy measure. So we actually decided to use a data analytic approach to see if we would observe these cut points naturally. She had the four categories: non-strategic, prosocial, bi-strategic, and antisocial. And she also had a normal category, which I think she just threw in just so she could compare the other groups. But we'll see if those actually emerge in a kind of data analytic approach. And will the cut points be the same as what she's found? So this is just humans saying, hey, this looks like a good cutoff. 1's a nice number. And we have data going from grade 8 to 12. So the question is, if you're in the bi-strategic group, does the composition of your strategy change through high school to become more extreme in your antisocial behavior or prosocial behavior? Are there changes in what a bi-strategic looks like? We just don't know. Most of the data hasn't been cohort data. We hypothesize non-strategics will be invisible, especially to the opposite sex. So non-strategic should receive the fewest opposite sex friendship nominations. Bi-strategic should be everybody but prosocial in the same sex, because Pat's found that before and they seem to have an advantage. what's interesting about this means that bi-strategics who have more negative qualities because they're high in antisocial behavior will do better than the non-strategics who don't have those negative qualities. That kind of sucks, doesn't it? But here's where they do better than even the prosocial. We're predicting that basically bi-strategics will beat the prosocial kids in opposite sex friendship nominations. And so this is another example where antisocial, can you just quit on Viber? That's Louise Hayes, my co-author, who's probably complaining about our publisher, justifiably. I know, my publisher's very good. Everybody should buy their books. I have more than one publisher, so you don't even know who I'm talking about. Do that after I get the contract rather than before. Okay, so I think one of the most striking predictions from resource control theory is that you predict that people with more so-called negative qualities do better than people without those qualities.
But they have more good qualities than the non-strategics too, right?
Yeah, so the main comparison would be antisocial versus non-strategic. We'll get to that. So you can find groups where they don't.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. And antisocial, okay, so bi-strategics beat prosocials. So there's one where the main difference is antisocial qualities. And antisocial will have the lowest well-being and self-esteem of all groups. So one of the things, I'm not talking much about this because this is kind of our dominant assumption, is that this use of coercion to become popular, control resources, may be effective, but it actually isn't need satisfying. In that if I am controlling, you guys are my friends and I'm kind of dominating you and just keeping you in line, I'm less likely to feel close to you or connected to you. Does that make sense? So the use of coercive strategies, antisocial strategies, is expected to have a negative effect on well-being, and this is pretty well shown in the literature, but we expect to see it here, and Pat didn't believe it. She thought the best bi-strategics would be doing pretty good. Okay, does that make sense? All right, let's get to some data. Oh, methods. 16 secondary schools, 2,800 students. We gave them measures of empathy and antisocial behavior. We only had it from grade 8 to 11. It's one of those things where you have to make a decision like you have because you're running out of space, and I'm like, I know I'm going to regret removing this. And there it is. As a matter of fact, when you think about removing something from a longitudinal study, that's the thing that's going to be the most important to your, you should just keep it in. But everything else is measured to all 12th grade. Yep. And we had people nominate their 5 closest male and 5 closest female friends within a year group. Next. Analysis. We did some badass non-parametric KML, 3D, and R for clustering joint trajectories. That sounds awesome, doesn't it? See, Phil has taught me the art of scaring the hell out of reviewers, so I'm just like, so I did have a reviewer in the last one say, what is that? I'm like, I'm not telling you, dude. Next. Multi-level negative binomial. So it turns out this distribution, we've compared this to Poisson's count data. So you can't use normal stuff. But this one seems to fit the data much better, negative binomial. So it's nested within person and school. And we did the same thing for well-being. And we also did something really cool that Belgender and Phil came up with, which is to estimate class probability based on the probability of somebody being in a group, rather than just us forcing them to be in their top probability group. So we get 25 imputations. And that allows us to represent the uncertainty of classification, because there might be some kids that are on the borders and they kind of, although the classifications were pretty clear, I saw the probabilities, it was pretty clear. So don't forget, these classifications are based on 5 years of data. All right, results. So first thing we did was looked at the kind of fit indices for the clusters. How many clusters do we have? So just to be clear, so we got 4 trajectories going across grade 8 to 11. So we have empathy, cognitive affective empathy, and aggression and rule breaking going across 4 years. So what this is clustering is the trajectories. Does that make sense? So how do these co-develop and co-evolve? So it's a little different from just your typical cluster analysis that takes place within a single cohort. And if you look at this, so higher numbers always mean improving. We thought that there was kind of a point at 4 where things either, kind of dropped rather steeply. And when we looked at the actual interpretations, when you went beyond 4, when you went to 3 profiles, we lose the bi-strategic group. If you go to 5 and 6 and 7 profiles, what it tends to do is just divide up the groups that are already there into smaller bits. So we thought 4 seemed to include the bi-strategic and was parsimonious, so we stayed with 4. Next. And here's what they look like. Okay, so these 2 things are empathy here, and the other 2, does this make sense, are antisocial behavior. So you see the antisocial are low in empathy and high in antisociality. And one thing to notice, remember the default cut points in Pat's work was 1. One thing to notice is that generally the cuts are much smaller when you do the cluster, so it's not as extreme. But the antisocial group is actually more extreme than her cut points, which was a surprise to me. So these guys are actually quite antisocial. So if our prediction that this group is better than non-strategic comes out, then that would be especially sad for those of us who are non-strategic.
What were the relative numbers?
I'll show you. I think that's the next slide.
Okay, good.
Oh, this is just across the years. So you can see it's pretty stable. Okay, so these are the numbers. Yes, we did have 90 antisocial girls, if you were wondering. Are there any antisocial girls in the world? Because I know you were having such a noble thought. So...
I was having a thought, and I just simply...
So, males tend to be much more non-strategic and antisocial. Girls tend to be more bi-strategic and pro-social. Very strong, it's a very strong gender effects. Resource control is very gendered. Okay, next. Okay, go one more slide, Phil, because this is complicated. Yeah, simplify it. Okay, so this is the effects on friendships.
You really like pink, don't you?
Yeah, well, why not? Are you saying that I'm not enough of a man?
Oh, jeez, you say that?
There was a delay of 10 seconds to answer. So really, I draw your attention, this is junior high, and I really want to draw your attention to this group. This is the bi-strategic. These are confidence intervals. So this is over 3 years. This is grade 8 to 10. And you can see that the top group, this is opposite sex. For both males and females, the top nominated group are the bi-strategics, but only in junior high. We'll talk about the developmental effect later. Well, I might just do it here while I'm here. So number 1 group were the bi-strategics, and the worst group, who else in this room were the non-strategics in their school? Yeah. Compassion brothers. Well, they were definitely in both males and females, so it's also females. They were getting the fewest female nominations. The difference is what, about 2? I wasn't getting a 2. I don't know what 2. But it's nice to see some non-strategics had some close girlfriend. No, I did have a close girlfriend. That's not true. I have one. Cool. My childhood wasn't as bad as I remember it. But this is I think it's a decent sized effect. It's at least more than a friendship difference. The prosocials get beaten, and even the antisocials, who have much more negative qualities than non-strategics, still more successful with the opposite sex. Now this is qualified, so this gives us hope, by a developmental interaction. And I think the simplest way to understand this is the bi-strategics kind of drop in value, but prosocial doesn't really. So the contrast group was prosocial, but you'll see that the simplest way to understand it is like the bi-strategic loses about a friend, opposite sex friend. That makes sense? So now they're not doing better than the prosocial. And the good news, can you go back just a step? The good news is now the non-strategics are not doing worse than the antisocial. So that hypothesis was supported, but only in junior high and senior high. These at grade 11 and 12, it seems to kind of disappear. And Phil, show me one more thing. And with same-sex, we're getting kind of the pattern we expect. The prosocials seem to be winning in both groups, so this kind of replicates. The bi-strategics are doing all right, but there's not as much difference between bi-strategics and non-strategics in same-sex, which is because as we argued, that the social control strategies are less important in same-sex relationships when you have a lot of common hobbies, sports, things that you can do together and kind of connect with people in ways that don't require those strategies. But generally, the prosocial seem to win in the same-sex relationships. Okay, next slide. Now this is the consequence for mental health, and Pat was, so I had to change the hypothesis to say we only predicted antisocial would be worse at mental health, but in fact, both antisocial and bi-strategic are much worse in mental health.
Which is what I predicted. For the record.
Okay. I was about to say that, Belginder. Belginder, personal communication.
Did you put it in the paper? Oh wait, I'm cool.
And the bigger effect, probably because I got to get moving, I'll just kind of say it verbally, is that women, or boys and girls, were equally effective at using resource control strategies, coercive strategies, to gain friendship nominations. But there was an interaction involving gender here. The cost of the strategy in terms of mental health was much worse for girls than for boys. Okay, so yes, girls can be aggressive and rule-breaking, but it costs, there's a higher associated cost in terms of mental health and self-esteem. Okay, so we'll just quickly go through these. Yes, we replicate the key groups of how these things. Cutoffs were lower. They weren't as extreme, except for antisocial, which was more extreme. Composition of resource control type kind of stayed the same. These are pretty stable variables. They are invisible. Being non-strategic wasn't so bad in male-male relationships. Bi-strategics beat everybody in both social and same-sex, true in females, but not males. So the bi-strategics didn't do that awesomely in the males, but they were still doing pretty good, but the prosocial was the one in males that was good, and females. Bi-strategics beat the prosocials and opposite sex in junior high. So this is an example of somebody with more negative qualities getting more close friendship nominations than somebody without those negative qualities. They had the lowest well-being. That was true. Pat would have predicted that, but the bi-strategics also seemed to pay a cost. And you should remember, the bi-strategics paid the same cost pretty much, but they were like about 0.7 standard deviations less antisocial than the antisocial group. So there might be something going on with the mix of empathy, because there's empathic distress and there's other things that could be happening, which are kind of interesting I can't talk to now. Yes, there was a developmental effect of the costs and benefits of using resource control strategies. Bi-strategics lose about one close opposite sex nomination from junior to senior high. And now they're no more nominated than the prosocial, so the prosocial suddenly catch up and break even. So prosocial looks like the winning strategy.
Yay.
Yay. Next. Oh, and this is kind of a study. Can you go up just a bit? Actually, just leave the title. I'll just walk you through it so you don't read it. So there's a bit of a question we had with the empathy paper, for example, because it looked like boys were not responsive to female empathy. And we couldn't tell if it was because they didn't notice it or they just didn't care, right? We did other studies. I did other studies in 2009, 2013, showing that boys don't seem to rate empathic girls as more agreeable or see their adaptive traits, that they seem to be invisible. Well, it could be that they're invisible or boys just don't use them. But what we found was, okay, can you go through it now? All the way. That boys are sensitive to empathy. They prefer prosocial over non-strategic girls. So they are sensitive to empathic-like qualities in the opposite sex. But the reason we didn't observe it is because we didn't do the resource control thing where we combined it with antisocial. So the reason why it disappears as a main effect is because boys also like antisocial and bi-strategic girls. So it kind of cancels out when you mix it all together like that. Next. So boys can tell. Herb needs to do some work. So this is a dream area for you, Herb. Honestly, the measurement is all over the place. It's multidimensional. It's got everything you could want. So first of all, you've got the different strategy types. This is what's called the form of the behavior, what it looks like, and that's what we mostly focused on here. But there's also the function. So what is the reason that they're being aggressive, for example? Is it to actually manipulate and control resources? Is it just a reaction? So the function is important. And then the effectiveness, another dimension. So somebody can be empathic, but they use it in a way that is more like co-rumination than an effective form of perspective taking. So really, we just focus on this. Other people just focus on some other aspect. Nobody focuses on all three of these things. And then on top of that, you have type of measurement. So peer versus self-report. So the reason why I'm interested in this topic is because I am a sheep, not a wolf. I'm prosocial. That is my value system. And when I see antisocial people seeming to kick butt and dominate, I get worried because I think, did we adopt the wrong strategy? So I think that the use of these coercive strategies is an adaptation to a niche. So if you want to reduce antisociality, the first thing you need to do is acknowledge that they have a function, that it is reinforced, that it's not just somebody, just kid reacting or has some sort of behavior problem. They could be doing this deliberately. This is a battle. I don't know if you guys remember what it was like to be in high school, but it was quite hard. And so the first thing is that if you want to create more prosocial communities, you need to deal with the kind of things that reinforce antisocial behavior, that support dishonesty, aggression, that kind of thing. My purpose is to arm sheep so that we can really deal with it. Next
Arm
slide.
them with what?
Knowledge. Okay, go back. I'm a wisdom and knowledge lover. Go back, I'll show you. That's knowledge. Knowledge. You're the sheep, and I'm helping to protect you with knowledge.
That doesn't look like knowledge.
I'm confused by it. What's your point?
It's a metaphor.
I thought bullets were going to come out of that drum thing on there.
I just think that,
It's hard to find a sheep with knowledge.
If you look at my kid, the advice you give to my kid Vincent about bullies, you got to include him, you have to put up with it. I don't agree with that. So he's very prosocial. He's a really kind kid. Both my kids are very gentle. I don't know how they get it because I don't want them to be this way because of this research. But that's not true, I'm joking. But he has to be able to stand up for himself and be assertive if not aggressive. And it's not true that people are just being misunderstood if they're bullies and they really have a kind heart. I mean, that may be true, but my point is that it's actually also reinforced. That it isn't just, defending against something and some sort of disorder. It's actually a strategy that they use. And the very thing that his little group had to do because this kid was being too rough and kicking people too hard and not wanting to play the games, it's actually correct for that group to start to exclude him until he stops doing that. So that would be an example, I think, of arming a sheep with the ability to say, you can say no, you don't have to play with that kid. This is really controversial in schools.
Joseph, do you see people falling into these different profiles on the back of Machiavellian scheming, or how much do you think variations in things like agreeableness could explain the pattern of results?
Yeah, empathy normally loads on agreeableness, but that's why we need Herb. If you can go back to that slide with the measures, because that's a great question. I think that Pat sees them a bit as Machiavellians, but like I say, social dominance and even aggression could be quite prosocial potentially. So that's why I think the function or goal, another code word for this is the value. What is your value? So one thing I really want to do if there's archival data sets like this is to look at if we could cross people who are aggressive with their value system. So you have prosocial people who are also aggressive and dominant. It might look quite differently. So you need to look at the function. What is it about?
Robin Hood types?
No, somebody who's revolutionaries, I guess, would be the archetype. I don't know. People who fight for something that's good, but they fight.
Activists.
Gandhi.
Yeah.
He didn't do much fighting.
He wasn't very aggressive.
Pacifist, yeah.
Oh, he was
Pacifist.
passive aggressive, but it was.
Maybe Malcolm X.
Okay.
Yep.
So I was just wondering if you could speak to these results in relation to the truth of group selection.
That's in my head, but we need at least a day for that.
No, one of the things that struck me about the bi-strategic group that is not present in, say, the prosocial or the antisocial group. So both of those groups is just the amount of whatever.
Yeah.
But the bi-strategic seems to conflate two things. One is having both of those things, and knowing when to deploy one over the other. And so I suppose my question is let's say you started off as bi-strategic, you had a lot of both, but you were really crap at knowing when to use one or the other. What happens to those people? Are they mixed in with that group? Do they end up going to one of the extremes? What happens?
That's a good question. I mean, I think our measurement approach is just too blunt. I think you're talking about the effectiveness. So one thing Emma and I found when we were reviewing this literature was that things would be defined inconsistently. So here we just said, you're bi-strategic if you're aggressive, break the rules, you take perspective, and have affective empathy. But sometimes they would define it as they're the kind of person that people follow, like almost just a leadership item. Or it would include effectiveness in it, like so I dominate in a way that I get people to do what I want. But I think effectiveness needs to be kept separate. So that's the question you're asking is like, if they have those strategies but they're ineffective at it, what happens? And we don't have the measurement hasn't separated it yet.
Yeah, I think it's not just effectiveness, I think it's also deployment skill.
Yeah. So flexibly, yeah, absolutely. So can they flexibly, do they know how to match the situation maybe? Yeah. It just hasn't been measured mostly because
Not effectiveness, but just a different kind of effectiveness. You can be effective in one, effective in the other, and effective in doing.
Effective and relevant.
But it's just because psychology treats aggression and social dominance as a kind of icky thing that is a disorder or a problem. And when Emma and I are reviewing the literature, you could literally divide the papers down to like maybe 80% are like, these people are dysfunctional because they're using aggression and they come from bad families, blah, 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 blah. And then 20% like the resource control type saying it's useful, it helps them.
So I think you're describing a bi-strategic wolf in a sheep pond.
Yeah. Sheep and ponds? Nice. A bi-strategic fish? Why didn't you just go with the fish? What's a bi-strategic fish? Well, it's not the ones that always get
The
eaten.
one that flaps like this.
Some fish are hermaphrodites.
Joseph,
Just saying.
I appreciate that you're talking about friendships rather than romantic relationships, but I'm wondering to what extent sexual preference might moderate any of these relationships. Do you have data on that?
I don't. I don't because it's complicated with ethics. I really want to ask the question, who do you want to shag? And list them up. But
I want to think about the wording on that ethics.
They might object.
I agree that sexual attraction is, I haven't figured out a way to measure that would get by both the school and the
Ethics.
ethics. But I think that's a really important question. I really wish I could measure that.
Maybe another question might be sort of to what extent you've sort of explored other outcomes other than friendship. So resource control, I mean, there could be many outcomes.
Well, one of the things I want to do, I'm going to talk to people in this room soon about it, because there's a lot of databases with prosocial and antisocial indices. And for example, there's a longitudinal study in America, Ad Health, which has success and career success, marriage, and all that stuff. So I think it's just a start, to kind of look at other aspects of success. I mean, Trump would probably have a lot of people that nominate him as a close friend, I would think. He doesn't look happy. Does he?
He looks orange.
I shouldn't assume everybody's anti-Trump here.
Clearly, Chris isn't.
The four groups were impressively consistent and stable over time and so forth. How much predictive validity did you give up by taking your continuous measures and basically dichotomizing them?
Yeah. I can't say the one issue I ran into, I wanted to do a kind of variable-centered version of this, but it just became too big because when you have a continuous variable times time times gender times da. But I think that the two we might have lost information. It's possible, but you do gain another way of looking at it. I think because it characterizes.
There's a parsimony. To try and present this presentation in terms of 2- and 3-way interactions would have been a pain.
and it was statistically impossible, but that isn't enough reason not to do it. But we were constantly having this variable-centered versus configural argument. I think they clearly complement each other. Like you could use a variable-centered approach and set the variables to 0.6 standard deviation on the, you could probably duplicate exactly the effects. But I really like.
Let me throw out a guess. I'm guessing that if you took the variables that you used to make your groups and looked at interactions between them and so forth, that you would increase your predicted validity by at least a quarter.
Really?
Yeah.
This is a growth curve model, though.
No, it's
so it's a little harder to come up with what those interactions would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because don't forget, this is a non-parametric growth curve model as well. So the changes in each of those it's definitely not continuous. It kind of changes more or less at different times. And then so you have 5 time periods. See, it gets complicated.
Yeah.
And I kind of like, as a kind of practitioner type, there's an appeal to this, which is not a scientific argument, to kind of characterize it in terms of identifiable subtypes. I know that that's not a scientific argument, but it's a way of looking at the data that's complementary to that. It might be able to increase the predictive power, but you're getting like 2 friendship differences between the top group and the bottom group, which I think is a decent size effect for something that doesn't share method variance.
No, actually, I was talking about it in terms of the mental health and stuff like that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I might have the power to do that. Yep.
So, just when I was at school, I was one of the sheep, and we formed a little flock of little sheep. But then, as a result, because we'd try to go to a movie, and everyone's like, "No, what do you want to watch, Joseph?" I became a wolf, right?
Oh, did you?
Well, because I was like, "No, guys, we've been here for 2 hours. We could have watched the whole movie. We're watching the movie, okay?" And Dawkins talks about evolutionary stable strategies and 2 ways of doing it. One is you have a group in which you've got a flock of sheep and then it's stable to have a wolf, or to have sheep who occasionally flip between wolf and sheep. So if in a society, it's evolutionary stable to have some philanderers because they have trust from everybody else, but they manage to reproduce more productively. And you can either have someone who occasionally becomes a philanderer, or you can have a group that's split up in terms of sheep and wolves. I wonder whether, because you've got the social network, you can somehow look at whether it is stable for whether all groups, for example, have some proportion of sheep and wolves, either within people or between.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping the reviewer doesn't ask that question because we can't, because the paper's so big right now, but that's an intriguing question. That's probably the next thing.
Separate.
Look at maybe cliques, and we know antisocial clusters. I think that's the clearest thing we know right now, based on the literature. So you're saying that you could have a big antisocial little fish effect potentially. So
well, that's a way of being a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Actually, that is a big fish little pond. You could if you're aggressive and your group is relatively less aggressive.
You only have to be a little aggressive.
The sign has to be opposite.
That's all we need.
That's all we need.
There is hints of it already in the results, though. I mean, one of the things that Joe split up between junior high and senior high, and that's not just for convenience sake. This was back when there was a choice of whether to go from year 10 to year 11. So there's a hidden selection variable here, and you notice that when you pick that selection variable, that some of the advantages of the bi-strategic and that sort of start to drop. So, I mean, it's quite abstract. But there is some kind of evidence of a hidden selection variable.
So maybe the bi-strategics are going out into the world more, or
I don't know. Going out into the world is the way that the government calls it. I mean, they call it not in education, employment, training.
But we should really do that big fish little pond with aggression.
Yeah.
Herb wants to be on that paper. Instantly add 100 public citations.
He does not want to.
Any other questions? These are really good questions.
How would you explain the differences in mental health between the girls who are antisocial.
I was just talking about gender about that. I mean, why does it cost women more to do this?
Is it about how they're perceived, not by their friend groups, obviously, but by the other?
That's a good point. Yeah, that could be it. Is there any differences in kind of females and males in terms of need satisfaction? Is it far worse for females to get less connection? It's the same need satisfaction.
What's the aggression measure? Is the aggression measure
Achenbach.
emotional or physical
It
violence?
has both types.
Right.
Gossiping, lighting fires, hitting. It's
Wasn't
bad.
there even an evolutionary basis for that?
For lighting fires?
No, for the aggression being worse for mental health of girls and boys.
Why? What would you say would be?
Well, the evolutionary basis would be the girls are the more nurturing, and the boys go out and fight fires or whatever. Yeah.
So the idea they're more. So it's more gender atypical maybe, but
Yeah.
does that cause misery? I don't know.
Well, I would hazard
To defy
guess
your
if-
gender, does that
If
cause?
you divided that aggression measure into physical aggression versus emotional aggression, I would guess that girls would be higher on emotional aggression than physical aggression.
Yeah.
And emotional aggression, especially if you're high empathy, is taxing. If you're
Okay.
going to be mean to someone, gossip about someone behind their back, you'll carry guilt about that.
Okay, so you reckon it's a different kind of aggression that has more psychological
Yeah.
costs.
That would be
I don't think the
yes.
Achenbach lets you do. I wish we had a measure that had both of those things in it,
Mhm.
because there's like indirect and direct aggression would be really
Could you look
nice.
at separate items?
There may not be enough. I remember looking at that and thinking there's a few passive aggressive. Yeah, maybe. But they correlate very highly. It's very homogeneous scale. It's like the alpha's 0.9. I know that doesn't mean that there's not heterogeneity, but yeah.
Maybe we'll separate that out in the bullying stuff.
Okay.
The different kinds of bullying.
Okay.
The physical versus the social. Yeah.
Why did the number of friendships not also the effect on well-being?
It's a good question. I mean, I think if somebody's popular and a lot of people think that they're their close friend, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you're one of these people who bullies everybody with R, and everybody says, oh, I'm really good friends with Teresa, but you're kind of a bit cynical. The metaphor we use, I was talking to Rich about this, and
She is.
and it's kind of like you can be successful. Like the metaphor, what Rich thought of when I told him about this was, it was like materialism, right? So people who are very successful at getting material goods aren't necessarily happier. So you could theoretically be very successful at getting everybody to want to be your friend, but the way you relate to them, which is a bit more negative, cynical, aversive, and as an object, like material possession, perhaps is less need satisfying for you, even though everybody's clamoring to be your friend.
Is there a measure of relationship quality as well as number? Is it a quantity-quality issue?
It's not really.
Right.
Not really, no. We need better measures of friendship, which I think that Ad Health has really detailed measures of friendship.
So if your friend could flip on you, if your friend's quite strategic and could flip on you at any moment from being nice to being aggressive, maybe that you might still need them, but you might not feel that relationship is as good.
Yeah, but it's the bi-strategic that's the one that's reporting.
Low.
I mean, we could look at if you have a lot of bi-strategic friends, if you're less happy, we could look at that. That's a really good question. The problem with the bigness of this data set is the reviewers are going to make me do a second paper.
I think that could also go both ways though. You like the recipient of a bi-strategic friend might feel that they would flip, but again, I don't know if you as the deliverer of good and bad would feel that that relationship is necessarily good. I can treat this person good, but I'm also totally capable of treating them badly. I'm not sure how highly you would rate the quality of that relationship.
But what if you're a bi-strategic but not towards your friend? You can be quite a bastard to other people.
Right. This is about the application of the strategies. Yeah.
Because I've seen psychopath is a bit of a strong word, but
For
bonding together to work because we both know that we're bastards, and I'll do that for you if you do that for me. So they actually look quite cooperative. It looks prosocial and cooperative, but it's because they both know we're both willing to bend the rules and let's help each other out. So it's actually cooperation
We're
between.
noting that really afterwards.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, but the example we talked about earlier about having a wolf in the group of sheep to protect. Not, so
that's
so
that's true. I mean, yeah, I guess in centuries ago, for example, I'm sure those warriors were quite, for the psychopaths, fearless, willing to kind of go out sensation-seeking and killing other people. Would have been good to have in the
That's
village.
true. You are keeping a wolf if they're going to protect you.
It's stable too, because as soon as you get two wolves within a group, they kill each other, and there's one wolf left, right?
Yeah.
This is literally the opening chapter to Robert Nozak's Libertarian. Bizarre.
let's see, could you get a quality of friendships by looking at number of first nominations versus total nominations? I mean, I don't know whether that would work or not, but I would think that the first person that you nominate is probably a closer friend. Yeah, or a stronger friendship bond.
Or a rank.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We need to look at that.
Do you have the data set up that way?
Well, we suggested that beforehand, but not necessarily that, but using the order effect as a weight. So rather than just having an unweighted mean, taking a mean where you're weighted by the inverse of position.
Because it is the first person you think of goes down, and then the next person,
Except if you have a whole class list and you're selecting from it, and that might be advertised.
that would throw it out. But this was actually a memory recall one, so it might work better. This might work better. Loretta's more like that.
Loretta's all right.
Yeah, it wouldn't work.
Because they actually are forced to look at every name.
And then select from all.
And it was just ticks.
This,
It wasn't-
but this one was they had to recall the name. So this one has more potential
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah. Well, sometimes even when you have the list, you ask for the numbers.
Yeah,
For second, third.
that would be a good idea.
Teacher Loretta.
This thing's being submitted Friday, so I'm not going to do anything really hard. But I do plan to keep doing the analysis that you guys were saying. I've been working on this. All this stuff took a long time for me to get on top of an R. So, yeah.
That's great.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.